Again, my name is Gina Rodriguez. I use the she, her pronouns. I serve as the Senior Project Manager for the Community Health Training Institute, and we are a team of folks here at Health Resources in Action that brings you trainings throughout the year. So this is part 2 of Reimagining Safety in Our Communities. And as a quick reminder, all of our trainings throughout the year are absolutely free, thanks to the generous funding from the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. So we are going to dive in. Yeah, there we go. I'm most excited. But why don't we remind ourselves who's in the room. So I'm going to hand it over to the team just so you know who's here today and who's going to be supporting today's training. So I'll pass it over to Tanayo to say hello.
Sure. Good morning, everybody. My name again is Tanayo Crow. I use she, her pronouns. I am a program associate at the Community Health Training Institute. I'm super excited to be here supporting some tech on the back end today. So if you have any questions, feel free to message me. And I will pass it over to Lauren.
Thanks, Tanayo. Good morning, everyone. My name is Lauren Bard. I'm a Senior Training Manager at Health Resources in Action. And I will pass it over to Mike.
Good morning, good morning. Welcome back. Good to see everyone again. I'm Mike Leonard. I'll be co-facilitating this training. I am project manager in the training capacity to building department at Health Resources in Action. I'll pass it on to Mo.
Good morning, all. I'm Mo Barboza. I serve as Senior Director of Community Engagement at HRIA, and I'll be assisting Mike with the facilitation today. Happy to be back with the group and good to see folks back and possibly some new folks as well. Anybody, could I just ask, if you were not here on Tuesday, could you just like wave or raise your hand or digitally raise a hand if you were not with us on Tuesday? Lauren, yeah. And Chris, awesome. Okay. And I'm going to assume that everybody else was here with us. Wonderful. Paula, okay. Thank you. I'll hand it back to Mike.
Beautiful. So I don't know if we want to pull up our slides perhaps so we can get into this. But we're actually just going to start with letting you all reintroduce yourselves to one another. We're going to do some small groups again to sort of warm us up and maybe start getting us thinking about a little bit about what we're going to talk about today and what we talked about on Tuesday. So go to the next slide, Gina. We have some prompt questions. These will go in the chat as well for when you're in your breakout room, but reintroduce yourself with your name and pronouns, your organization and role, which city or town you're joining us from. And then today's question is, what is something you are still thinking about from our discussion on Tuesday? We kind of covered a lot. So think back all the way back 48 hours ago and try to remember what it is we all talked about, what we discussed. You know, we had a pretty broad ranging conversation starting to really define what public safety actually even means. Trying to sort of expand our own definition of what that is. We looked at some examples of the way that public safety has excluded various groups of people in the US. We looked at the sort of historical connection between slavery, slave patrols, policing. We talked a little bit about housing and started thinking about some of these broader questions as well, which we're going to continue this morning as well. We talked about the war on drugs as well as an example of the way that sort of public safety initiatives can be, you know, detrimental to public safety or have been in U.S. policy in history. So that's what, you know, hopefully that was a good reminder. But so anything you're still holding on to, wondering about, wanting to discuss today is welcome and fair game to discuss in your small groups. So we'll go, let's say about 8 to 10 minutes together. We'll do groups of like 3 people. So hopefully everyone, you know, make sure everyone gets a chance to share in your group, and we'll see you back in 8 to 10 minutes. Sorry, folks got cut off at the end there, but hopefully you got to a chance to reintroduce yourself, maybe talk to somebody you didn't talk to last time. anything that folks, wanted to let us know about that, you're looking forward to talking to, or you were still wondering about from last time, or anything that came up like that folks want to share before we dive in to day 2? All right, well, don't say I didn't ask. No. Well, if there is anything, if you want to throw it in the chat, that's totally fine. We want to definitely make this a sort of responsive and continuous conversation from last time. So don't want to like leave you in the dust if you're still like, well, I didn't get a chance to think about this. We didn't get a chance to talk about this. Please do let us know. But hopefully this is continues to be a good conversation. Just want to remind you all of the learning objectives that we introduced last time. So these were kind of for both days. So we said we would define safety in the context of community and identify ways in which Black and Brown communities have been historically made unsafe in the US. That's kind of really what we focused on in that first day. Number 2, think creatively about changes we want to see in our own communities moving forward. We're going to do a lot of sort of creative visioning around that today. And lastly, name strategies to amplify community voice and role in maintaining safety, justice, and equity. And that we'll also be talking about today, hopefully giving you a chance to sort of, again, imagine, design, create solutions for your own community, for your own neighborhood that are integral to safety in your own view. So we're gonna be doing some of that today. We're gonna be watching another video today. We're gonna be talking about some more history, but also sort of thinking about the future and today. So those are our learning objectives. And then the agenda for today is as follows. So kind of in our welcome back right now, we're going to talk about how safety rests on broad-ranging systems. So thinking, even more expansively about housing, kind of zooming out from just sort of law enforcement as our understanding of public safety, but thinking about other ways, other aspects of our lives and our neighborhood and our infrastructure that impact our safety. We're going to take a break. Then we're going to brainstorm about, okay, what are all of those things, right, that actually affect safety? Can we get all those things down? Because we're going to do an activity after that. We're calling it Building Just and Safe Solutions. But again, thinking about, well, how can we design elements, structures, agencies, policies, right, that will uphold people's safety in that sort of comprehensive sense, right, and not be sort of limited in scope or in perspective. So I'm going to be giving you some time in small groups to really design and think about that together. Before we close out, and again, we'll share some resources, some ideas. We'll share a little bit of our contact info and an opportunity to give us feedback about these 2 days of training. But any questions about the learning objectives, the agenda that we have for today? Again, we'll be together from now until 12:30. Any questions, comments, concerns? Mo, anything to add?
I'm good.
Beautiful. All right, I think we're ready. One last thing I want to remind you about is the group agreements that we had last time for how we want to have the conversation. I just want to thank folks for really adhering to these and remembering them really well. And I think we had a really respectful, balanced, really deep and provoking conversation. So I'll give folks a chance to just sort of skim this list again. Remind yourself of these. Okay. And anything that folks, given the conversation last time, how it went, anything folks want to add to this list for today? All right, well, if folks feel good about this list still, can you give me just a thumbs up so I can see the agreement? You can do a virtual thumbs up as well if you're not on camera. It's totally fine. All right, I see a decent number of thumbs, but if you have anything to add, please do drop it in the chat. But let's get going in this conversation. We're going to start with, again, this conversation about thinking about broad-ranging systems that affect safety. We're going to actually look at a video, and so I'm going to pass it to Mo to kind of take us through this.
Great. Thank you, Mike. I just wanted to connect back some of what we talked about yesterday, and there are some of the threads in yesterday's conversation that are really important to pull out. Partly that they play such a role in how our ideas of public safety have been made in the US, and partly because if we're really going to reimagine, we need to rethink some of the spaces that those threads kind of inhabit. So one of those threads was around the protection of property, whether it was around the protection of shipping and commerce, as it started with the patrols in the Boston region and the northern colonies, so Boston first and then Philadelphia and New York. These night patrols became a way to control certain groups, and they targeted certain groups. In the South, the slave patrols also were trying to enforce this protection of the status quo and protection of the property. And so that idea of keeping the existing power dynamic in place, and that the police have been used to do that. And sometimes that gets called, really thinking about public order. Extending that idea of protection of property, so many of the laws that we have created in the United States have been really focused on that protection of property. And so a large piece of law enforcement then becomes related to that piece. And I forget who brought this up, but that, our home is our castle. That castle doctrine is such a big piece of how our laws are even in place, that the idea that there is a sanctity of your four walls, whether you're in an apartment or a house or a condo, whatever it happens to be, and that in that place you should have final say and rule over the space and be powerful in that place. And so a lot of our laws are set up to protect the sanctity of that kind of framed power for the person whose home it is against the world around them. And then our ideas of public safety have been about the protection of those spaces and who gets to, have and be protected and who is not. So we thought today it'd be really important to really interrogate that framing around property and the home and spaces by looking at how our current concept of who lives where and how issues of policing and public safety have been tied to those spaces. So we're going to watch a video. This is one of my favorite videos. It actually comes from a book that I recommend to everybody called The Color of Law. This is a video that looks at how we got to such segregated spaces and how the conditions of those spaces were so radically different for different folks. We're going to do this in some sections. So there's about 4 little vignettes. And so we'll stop after each vignette, talk about it a little bit. I'll take your reactions, and we'll, kind of try to tease apart some of the elements of it and think about where our conceptions of public safety relate to it. And if there's anything that we need to also examine from it, I'll invite you all to be a part of that. Any questions before we get started? All right, so this is Segregated by Design, and we'll watch the first piece of it and go from there.
In the middle of the 20th century, the city of St. Louis, Missouri, and the United States federal government condemned and demolished the neighborhoods in downtown St. Louis where African Americans lived, displacing thousands. They built the Gateway Arch. They built a university, interstate highways, hospitals, and middle-class housing that was unaffordable to the former African American residents. Those who were displaced then relocated to the few other places available, converting inner ring suburbs like Ferguson into new segregated enclaves. We have been led to believe that racial segregation in housing was de facto segregation, by accident or the result of private prejudices. Yes, private prejudice clearly contributed to segregation, but by itself it could not have segregated the country without the intention of the federal government to segregate neighborhoods throughout the nation. If, however, we understand the accurate history, the history that was once well known, but we've all now forgotten, that racially segregated patterns in every metropolitan area like St. Louis were created by de jure segregation, racially explicit policy on the part of federal, state, and local governments designed to segregate metropolitan areas, then we can understand that we have an unconstitutional residential landscape. And if it's unconstitutional, then we have an obligation to remedy it.
So that's our first piece there. Anything jump out for y'all from that first piece? Anything jump out for you? How many folks have seen this video before? Okay, we got a couple folks. Okay, good, good. I'm glad my team raised their hand. That's wonderful. All right. So one of the places that that the narrator mentions is Ferguson, and for many folks, Ferguson has become this, this signal of both the excesses of the ways in which public safety has been acting in communities, and a really clear example of public safety not being safety for everyone, and a real rebellion against the system, how it was. And hopefully folks have, been exposed to some of this information, but I'll tell you a little bit about Ferguson, having been there myself. I actually went to school in St. Louis, and Ferguson was a place that was basically a Black suburb or suburban space, a little bit more urban than suburban, but largely Black, and policed by a mostly white police force that was famous to everyone for harassing Black motorists and people passing through. So you wouldn't pass through, if you didn't have to go there. And what was uncovered there is that the police force basically was over arresting people of color and fining them for their revenue that then paid for the police department. A really perverse circle that really created the need for the police to continue to harass and fine people to be able to pay their bills, basically. And a lot of that was, well documented long before the kind of rebellion and the Mike Brown's murder and the things that happened after. But that was set up. It became a place that had this dynamic long before Mike Brown's death. The people who lived there were under the thumb of the police long before that, and that they had been made to live there. This wasn't a choice. There were many communities around it that they could not buy a house in, or rent an apartment in, or go to, even go shopping or so forth. This was a place for Black folks in St. Louis, in the St. Louis County area. Let's keep going with the video. If there aren't any other comments, I think the next couple will be a little bit more provoking.
The federal government in the New Deal of the Roosevelt administration of the 1930s pursued policies in the mid-20th century that segregated metropolitan areas. One important policy was the first civilian public housing program, which frequently demolished integrated neighborhoods in order to create segregated public housing. In the late 1930s, another New Deal program, the United States Housing Authority, was adopted, The very first projects built under the United States Housing Authority authorization were in Austin, Texas, because the most aggressive proponent of public housing at that time was the congressman from Austin, Lyndon Baines Johnson. And Johnson got the United States Housing Authority to put its first projects in Austin, separate projects for whites, for African Americans, and a project for Hispanics. The project for African Americans was placed in a location that the city plan of Austin had designated as a ghetto for African Americans. The United States Housing Authority and the local Austin Housing Authority demolished something called Emancipation Park, which was a celebrations location for the abolition of slavery. The design was to move all African Americans in the city of Austin into this community, whether in public housing or in private housing. The city of Austin then began to close schools for African Americans elsewhere in the city and close libraries and other public facilities to force African Americans to move to the east side. Another program that the federal government pursued to enforce segregation was the work of the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, which subsidized the development of suburbs like Levittown, New York, on condition that they only be sold to white families and that the homes in those suburbs had deeds that prohibited resale to African Americans. The Federal Housing Administration's underwriting manual said that inharmonious racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities, meaning that loans to African Americans could not be insured. Government at all levels throughout the nation were involved in promoting and enforcing the restrictive deeds in homes and places like Levittown, and judges enforced the view that these deeds did not violate the Constitution because they were private agreements. Although white middle-class families that moved into suburbs like Levittown could buy property with no down payments if they were veterans and low-interest mortgages, middle-class African Americans had to make substantial down payments and get uninsured mortgages with higher interest rates. In many, if not most cases, African Americans could not get mortgages at all because the federal government would not insure them. As a result, they bought their homes on contract, like an installment plan where they accumulated no equity and could be evicted from their homes in the event of a single missed payment. Thus, contract buyers do not have the option of leaving a declining neighborhood before their properties were paid for in full. If they did, they would lose everything they'd invested in that property to date.
All right, reactions. Anything jump out at you? Anything stand? Go ahead, Katie.
One of the things that stood out to me was about how they weren't able to build equity with their housing and how that contributes to the lack of generational wealth that has been developed for Black and Brown families, and how that rate, especially in Boston, I think for every, I'm going to get the statistic wrong, but
I'll help you. Go ahead.
But white families, there's like, it's in the thousands for the
household wealth is about 250,000 Greater Boston and $8 for African Americans. Yep.
Yes, and housing policy like that has contributed to that.
Thank you. Other reactions?
It's Shay. Good morning.
Go ahead,
And
Shay.
the other thing is that the saddest part of this, that was created, that was designed. So, you know, that's the heartbreaking of all of that. From 400 years to now, it was just designed. And that's the heartbreak about all of this. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Shay. Bill.
Yeah, I grew up in the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles, and it's amazing that the entire valley was covered by private covenants, which prevented the properties being sold after the war to people of color. And so it's not only the federal government in terms of explicit law moving people into public housing and ghettos, but it's also places where the law, as Rothstein talks about, really protected the housing industry from any type of development that they didn't want to subsidize. So it's pretty devastating. And there's a lot of pushback in San Fernando Valley today about that. But when I lived there, it was a very white place in the 1960s.
Thank you, Bill. Michelle.
I think the toughest part of it is that it's still happening, like today. Like it's still very relevant when you think about the seaport that was just designed. Like every time I walk through there as a Black woman, I look for Black people and I don't see any for the most part. Or even in today's globe, you know, they're shutting down the one pool for young people in Mattapan at a elementary school. And yeah, and when you think about like the folks that are like doing like all this DEI work within organizations, I know there are often people like, can we, like, how do we move forward? Well, it's hard to move forward when you live in these spaces every single day.
Amira.
Yeah, and I think something I got out of this video too is the fact that like the New Deal program, even though it was a federal program that was supposed to like improve the economy and really help lift low-income people out of their circumstances, it was mostly targeted towards low-income and middle-class white Americans. And still further, I forgot who said it, but they were just talking about the the racial economic gap between Blacks and Black Americans and white Americans, and how that is actually widened due to these programs, because low-income white Americans were able to still lift themselves up from their bootstraps during those times when it was helpful, when they had like opportunities to get a lot of federal aid and get mortgages and get help and a lot of assistance. And even if they were like a Black veteran even if they served the country, they were not able to be eligible for these same programs and buy a house coming back from fighting. And I forgot where they were fighting in World War I. That's awkward, sorry. But yeah, so it's really unfortunate. I think I really did like that pinpoint. I always think about this narrative that people should just lift themselves out of from their bootstraps, but it proves that people do not even have those bootstraps to begin with, because these programs were not made for them. And talking about African Americans.
Cara?
Thanks, Amira. Couldn't agree more. And I think what's hardest for me is that what's happening around school systems now, of people not allowing people to even know this information. There's we don't want our white children to feel uncomfortable or that part is the part that makes me the angriest out of all of it, because, and I apologize if I'm saying this as my white implicit bias, I'm doing my best, but I just so angry that we can't make change because people are like, we're not talking about this. We have this narrative. We don't want to, we don't buy it. We're not listening. We're not going to accept it. We're not going to let you indoctrinate our children in this false narrative of racism. We're not racist. And it's the most racist thing there could ever be, is to say, we're not going to talk about racism. I don't know what could be more racist to say, I'm not going to learn about it. I'm not going to understand it. And I just don't, I feel overwhelmed and infuriated by it.
Thank you, Cara. Bethany.
Thank you. I just wanted to add that I think looking at this through the lens of kind of the tenets of white supremacy culture, individualism is a very strong theme in white supremacy culture. If you work hard, you'll get ahead. It's up to the individual what happens to them. And when you look at these massive systems that have been created to do exactly the opposite of that, and then we're still telling people, if you work hard, you'll get ahead. And it's just not true. It's a sham.
Layla. Still can't hear you, Ms. Gibson Green.
I'm sorry, I do it every time. This is very touching for me because it takes me back to my childhood. I am a product of the housing authority, quote, quote, the ghetto. But I never knew, for me, I was so young, I thought it was just, where we lived. As I got older, I realized and could see the segregation, because it was predominant the area where the Blacks lived. but to listen to this and actually put a name on it, segregation in space, segregation by design, you know, it's eye-opening for me. You know, I would definitely do my research on this. And I know we a bit, this is down south, is where I was born. Eventually we made our way to New York City. There you had Spanish Harlem on one side, quote, quote, Harlem or Black Harlem on the other side, all the different segregation of individual living. But to know that this is how it was designed, man, I'm not surprised, but it's tugging on my heart to do more research and do something about it now, because now I've came full circle. I'm old enough to know better. And yes, it's still happening. If I go down south, they're still segregated in these different areas because that's all they know. And to know LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, had something to do with this. You know, I heard his name when I was younger, but I didn't know what my grandparents was talking about. So it's just, it's touching my heart. This is something that I'm really going to move forward in and do some more research and advocate deeply. So thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
Vishnu, you had your hand up.
Oh, I took it down, but I want to talk like a little bit more. Like it is on I came here in 2009, and when I was in my country, I thought like this America is the different image in my own chapter of America. And when I came here, all this happening over here, and we thought this country has all human rights and all the laws in the country. But when we see, they don't tell us like direct in our face. They will play their card like in our back. So I don't know, like and when I see this video, when I watch this video, I have thought like those kind of thing has make the people of color like backwarded from the people of like the white class people. So still now we are struggling to get in the steer to compete with the people who has like a majority of the people. So I think that is why like in the politics also, in the like private areas or in the like government areas, so like people with the color are the less. I think due to the education, due to the opportunity that they should have get like before, like in 19th or 20th century, like, but still the people of color are lacking in their education, like because our parents never have that opportunity to raise us as educated children, and like we are lacking due to that systematic racism in our country, I guess, like, and that is why we don't have like equal, if it is like, if they are treating us equally also, but we are lacking on our own like side, like we don't have those opportunity in those days. So still there is a big gap between us. And I think like in this group, all the people are like-minded, like they knows what other people goes through. There are so many people out there, they don't like to hear this one, they don't like to watch this video, they don't like to like even think what they goes through. So I don't know how to bring those group in the group. They can listen, they can feel, they can feel us.
Yeah. Vishnu, thank you so much, because you bring up two really important points. That idea of the folks who don't want to hear this, that's people of color as well as white people. There's, you know, I'm an immigrant myself, and a lot of, you know, my folks who come from my country as well, they're like, no, this is the greatest country there's ever been, and nothing can be a blemish on this because we have given up everything to come here. There are lots of reasons why people hold on to their idea of what this country is supposed to be, even in the face of some of these examples. And that's something that we also have to interrogate. Like it can't be that we just hand people what we see as the truth and expect them to take it, because they won't. We need to find other methods to do it. I appreciate you for bringing that up. Amira.
I'm sorry for talking a lot, but I just also wanted to say this point too. I think it was very symbolic for the first, like in Austin, Texas, when they actually demolished the Emancipation Park. And that was the first time they actually built housing projects in quote unquote the ghetto, and targeting for Black African Americans. I think that was just very symbolic for, even as you think of after slavery and after Reconstruction, and even like still in Jim Crow, so like, oh yeah, we're offering you guys these project housing that's subsidized. Tearing down Emancipation Park and what that actually symbolizes, the end of slavery, but it's actually kind of the continuation. I thought that actually really spoke volume.
And just to make some quick connections, Emancipation Park, that was Juneteenth. This is Texas. This is where Juneteenth kind of comes from. And this is the space that they decided to, put the first housing development in and move everybody to the east side. I don't know if anybody's been to Austin. It still looks like that. What they created by moving everybody who used to be in the different parts of Austin into the east side still looks like that. The east side still has the majority of the African Americans, and they've concentrated poverty by reducing opportunity in that space. One of the other threads in this was that previously integrated neighborhoods were segregated by design. So they destroyed integrated neighborhoods and put in their place segregated spaces. When I read the book, I was floored because I grew up in Cambridge, and there were two housing developments right next to each other, Washington Elms and Newtown Court. And I never understood why this one-lane street separated these two housing developments. Well, when they were built one for white people and one for Black people. And that in a fairly liberal space, but that was the design. One of the other things that we don't go into here was also that most of the housing developments were in the beginning built solely for white people. And then over time, they built the others for other folks as well. So around the country, while LBJ did that in Austin, around the country, most of the housing developments were built for white folks, poor white folks, so that they could come out of the Depression, and then after the war, for folks to coming back to the war, people were moved out of there to other neighborhoods. If you're familiar with Boston, there's a dynamic of people moving from Southie and Charlestown, where the housing developments were built initially, and moving to West Roxbury. They initially were also moving from Dorchester, where housing developments there were mostly white at first too, and moving to what was thought about as the suburban areas of Boston. We are going to get into how some of that happened in the rest of the video, but I want to take a couple comments before we go back. Mike and then Shay.
I'll let Shay go first.
Okay. Go ahead, Shay.
Thank you, Mo. Something else I wanted to allude to, and that specific areas or redlining also, it happening all over the United States. In Medford, I'm from Massachusetts. In Medford, there is one area, it's only Black people you found there. And again, according to what you're showing us and teaching us, it was all by design. And I know Cara mentioned something that I wanted to pinpoint about it, how that feels hurt to her. We need those allies. Sometimes as minorities, Black and brown, we're talking about that, nobody's listening. But we need our white allies to come out and speak about this, to say that it is wrong. And very briefly again, we talk about affirmative action, where people say, no, we're giving Black things they're not worthy of. But this is how the affirmative action come into being, because Black were left out. So we need the white allies. Thank you, Cara, for talking about it. And I hope after today, learning from the panel there, and you could go about that and spread the word, because we need the allies in order for that to change. Thank you, Mo.
Thank you, Shay. West Medford was where African Americans and a lot of Caribbean Americans were able to move to once they made enough money to move from housing developments or from apartments, because they could buy homes in West Medford. And that was, again, it was redlined for only people of color to be in. Mike.
The other thing that like watching this video reminds me of is like not only that like the impact of these policies was to like literally segregate people, but it also just like devastated our urban infrastructure. So the Twitter account that I just dropped in the chat is like really cool because it like will it overlays basically photos of, you know, 50 years ago and today, like the same neighborhoods, or 100 years ago and today, like the same neighborhoods, how they transformed because a highway was built through them, right? So that they could suburbanize, right? And there was white flight and people could move out of the city. Or, you know, how there's big, beautiful church and then like now it's a parking lot or something. So because people are using their cars and things like that. And so when we think about, right, like all these things that impact safety, right, like our transportation, right, our public transportation or lack thereof, literally like green space, like all these things that we could have in the city that are gone or just don't exist. You know, I was thinking about how there used to be like the trolley car system as an example, that so few cities have retained like a trolley car system. And that was a way that people got around the city, right? That was just kind of like completely scrapped in favor of cars, in favor of people getting from the far suburbs into the city, mostly white people who had jobs in the city that lived in the suburbs. So, and I think the video is going to kind of go into this a little bit more, but yeah, it's like, it is infuriating, I think someone said, so.
All right, Kara, we're going to take one more from you and then we're going to move forward. Go ahead, Kara.
Thanks, Mo. Yeah, there's so much to say, but one thing that came out, it's about how not even that we're denying that we have to have the conversation, white people, is that we like also that like how it's bred this normal way of thinking that like white people are so like don't even know they're doing. And I grew up on Long Island. I had friends in Levittown. I went in those houses in the 1990s. And one of the things that came out of the Long Island newspaper, if you don't know this, there's a good documentary called Newsday, or good documentary made by Newsday, the newspaper down there, and how the real estate agents still, when people come in, choose where they're going to show you houses, no matter how much money you have, no matter what you say you're interested in, they take you to the neighborhoods based on your race. And so they're maintaining it, not because that there's a policy or they think they are doing it intentionally, but they're so acculturated, indoctrinated into this system of maintaining it, and they don't want to hear differently either. They don't want to have the conversation and they don't want to believe it, but they keep doing it.
Thank you, Kara. One thing I want you to keep thinking about as we go into the next videos here, these were laws at the federal level and state level and some ordinances at the city level. All of these were being enforced by our public safety officers. So if you were doing it wrong by the laws, the police are the folks who showed up to enforce this. And so they've been set up to be the operants of what the norm should be. So that's going to be something I want you to keep thinking about as we move forward. Let's go to the next section in the video.
The term redlining comes from the federal government's creation of maps of urban areas nationwide. And those maps were color-coded to indicate where it was safe to insure mortgages. Anywhere African Americans lived, even places where African Americans lived nearby, were colored red to indicate to appraisers that these neighborhoods were too risky for the FHA to insure. The FHA's justification was that if African Americans bought homes in white neighborhoods, or even if they bought homes near those neighborhoods, the property values of the homes they were insuring, the white homes they were insuring, would decline, and therefore their loans would be at risk. In 1940, for example, a Detroit builder was denied FHA insurance for a project that was near an African American neighborhood. He then constructed a half-mile concrete wall, 6 feet high and a foot thick, separating the two neighborhoods, and then the FHA approved the loan. In the 3 decades during which it administered this policy, however, the agency never provided or obtained evidence to support its claim that integration undermined property values. In fact, Often racial integration caused property values to increase because African Americans' housing supply was so restricted and they had so many fewer choices. If African Americans had access to housing throughout metropolitan areas, supply and demand balances would have kept their rents and home prices at reasonable levels. Without access, landlords and sellers were free to take advantage of the greater demand relative to supply for African American housing. A 1946 National Magazine article described a Chicago building where the landlord had divided a 540 square foot storefront into 6 cubicles, each housing a family. He had similarly subdivided the second story. Total monthly rent was as great as that generated by a luxury apartment on Chicago's Gold Coast along Lake Michigan. Such exploitation was possible only because public policy denied African Americans opportunities to participate in the city's white housing market.
Anything come up for you from that one? What jumped out at you? I know it was quick. Go ahead, Rebecca.
This is kind of a holdover from the last one as well, but
Cool.
I'm just thinking about the ways that these policies are explicitly and implicitly about race. Like there are some policies that explicitly name race in them, and some that are that don't, that pretend that they're race neutral, but that are actually having impacts that create additional racial disparities. And so the policymakers or people in power are pretending that they don't know what the impact is going to be. But the ultimate result is increased segregation, increased prices for African American communities. The result is the same, even if people are pretending they aren't doing it on purpose.
Absolutely. Chris?
I just think it's interesting and just important to see how kind of the difference between what like property owners and insurers have fears about and what they think is the case versus what the actual data shows. You know, that they keep making certain claims that property value will go down, whatever, and then it's just shown like there's no data to suggest that. In fact, it would be, you know, the exact opposite. So it kind of shows that the decision for segregation came first, and then the justification came after, and then it just gets doubled down over time.
Absolutely. Bill?
Yeah, amazing how, and a few people have alluded to this, is just, you know, how it's really the market now that has taken over, both in terms of, you know, private mortgage insurance and zoning and other things that keep these policies alive in areas where, you know, it was first created by, you know, kind of government edict. And so it's kind of baked into the system. So changing it is so difficult because you really have to change the way in which mortgages are given out, and, you know, while people are qualified, and, you know, all the other complications in order to get into a house today really reinforces the entire system nationwide.
Yeah, and just pulling the thread from Rebecca, Chris, to Bill, that system right now, you know, you don't have to say, the folks who are trying to keep it in place, they don't have to talk about race at all, because they're putting it on top of the racially segregated system that already exists, the racial wealth gap that already exists, and certainly just by having a price that's high enough, you keep the same dynamics in place. And thank you, whoever, I forget who talked about the, I think it was Kara, that the mortgage folks and realtors will only show you certain properties. Not only does that happen now, but that was the not model, that was the policy of the American Realtors Association for a long time until they were sued and so that they could have that policy. Still to this day, really well qualified African Americans are not shown properties that they otherwise might be interested in because realtors don't even make that available to them. They won't even know that those properties are up for sale. Now, there's been a lot of democratizing of that using sources online to help people see it. But one of the things that also happens is on the other side of that, if you're an African American trying to sell your house is undervalued by the people who set the value for the house. There's a national example a few months ago that kind of illustrated that by just having a white person be the person who shows the house to the person evaluating, they jump the price of the house or what it was worth. And many folks who are selling their houses will remove all their pictures of anything that relates to their race or heritage purposely so that when people go to buy it, they will offer a higher price. Lots of these things persist, but they come from this era. And one of the things I want to make sure that we recognize is that there is not like a straight line. It really goes up and down. We were less segregated, then we became more segregated, we got less segregated, and we've gotten more segregated. It's not a straight line there, and policies and laws are what has been creating this. Is what the author of Color of Law posits, is that this is made by design. The segregation by design is done on purpose and often destroying integrated spaces that they were in before. This next section is going to really talk a little bit more about some of how we conceive about who lives where, and look for those examples of where our public safety ideas are both connected and where public safety officers are then used to keep the norm in place. All right, let's go to the next one.
As the federal government concentrated low-income African Americans in single neighborhoods, the homes became overcrowded. Families had to subdivide their homes to make their mortgage payments and their property tax payments. Cities frequently withdrew public services from African American neighborhoods. They collected garbage less frequently. They didn't provide water and sewer services. Polluting industry and toxic waste plants were placed in African American communities in order to protect white neighborhoods from deterioration. The result was that African American neighborhoods frequently turned into slums. White homeowners looked at these places and assumed that slum conditions were characteristics of African Americans, not of government policy that forced this kind of overcrowding. White homeowners then became resistant to African Americans moving into their neighborhoods because they thought they would bring slum conditions with them. Of course, the slums were not created by the people. They were created by the forced concentration, the overcrowding in these neighborhoods. Blockbusting was a scheme in which speculators bought properties in borderline black-white areas, rented or sold them to African-American families at above-market prices, persuaded white families residing in these areas that their neighborhoods were turning into African-American slums and that values would soon fall precipitously, and then purchased the panicked white homes for less than their worth. Blockbusters' tactics included hiring African-American women to push carriages with their babies through white neighborhoods, hiring African-American men to drive cars with radios blasting through white neighborhoods, or making random telephone calls to residents of white neighborhoods and asking to speak to someone with a stereotypically African-American name, like Johnny May. State licensing agencies that regulated real estate agents could have easily stopped this practice. All they had to do was to lift the license of one or two real estate agents who engaged in these practices, and the practices would have ended.
Stop. Thank you. Any reactions to that? Does that sound familiar? There's a few folks that I've been just watching their face as they've been hearing this stuff. I'm not going to ask you to opine, but I see it on your face. So, no, if there's no comments or questions, we got one. Go ahead, Katie.
I was just going to say, like, the extent that the real estate and the housing authorities would go to just to make sure that the segregated neighborhoods stayed in place, like by hiring Black women to push baby carriages or soliciting phone calls. Like they're just doing so much extra just to reinforce segregation. It's almost like nonsensical. Besides for the only reason that could possibly be like attached to it is racism.
Absolutely. Brother Al.
Thank you, Mo. You know, a well-designed system to segregate African-American people from this white society it's just amazing to have my eyes open up, to enlighten my eyes to something that's always been there and I ignored it. I can remember when here in Springfield on the north end was predominantly African-American homes and people and businesses. When they brought in 291, I didn't know at the time when they brought in 291 to integrate African-American neighborhoods and put us, and it just disrupted the whole neighborhood on the north end, Bond Street, Crew. Then they made the projects out there, Riverview, big old apartment complex, man, and just putting people everywhere. For me, I moved on the hill, which was Mason Square at the Winchester Square at the time, Mason Square, where they had factories and everything. But it's just to see that they still have these tactics in place, and it's crazy. Will we ever get to the point where every man and woman that African American can be treated equally? We got a long fight, man. This fight is going to be going on after me, and I always go back to Martin Luther King, the speech, man. You know, I have a dream that one day the nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of his creed. His true meaning of his creed is not for us; it's for the white folks. And talking about we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men be created equal. I won't see it. You know, to be honest.
I hear you. And one of the things, you know, again, as an immigrant, I come to this country with a strong belief in what the country could be, not necessarily what it is. And so to see it creep closer to what it could be, even sometimes slowly and slip back sometimes, as someone put in the chat, definitely there's some slipping back going on. That gives me a little bit of hope. But I'm with you, Brother Al. I'm not sure that we will see it within our lifetimes, maybe a little bit better. And just to, you know, some of the ridiculousness that you just talked about there is going to come up in the next section around slum clearance. But in the North End in Springfield, kids have to walk under the highway to get to school.
Yeah,
they built they built the center, like the community center for kids, in the ground under the highway, because that's where there was land to do it. Because that's literally the highway was built through the middle of the neighborhood. I live in Newton. Newton has a 150-year-old Black community that's been here, you know, businesses, churches, homes, and so forth. But no one thinks of Newton as a Black, you know, place, because when the Mass Pike was built, 3/4 of that neighborhood was destroyed. A lot of this comes from that era. We're going to take 2 more comments and then talk about slum clearance. Go ahead, Natalie.
It's just eye-opening to see that all these practices are still in place. I live in Newport, Rhode Island. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. A lot of people don't even really know that there is a North End. A lot of people don't know that gentrification happened, and it's still happening now. In the North End, they're looking to build a 6-lane highway for traffic that comes into Newport. And even though the community said that we didn't want it, we're still going about doing it. When it comes to public comment and resident engagement, they ignore it. They ask for it, but then they ignore it. These are things that the heads work on with the residents in order to build their voice. And even going to city council meetings and things like that, the pushback is real. And just to see that in other places that this is also happening or has happened, and then like the development of the areas is not what the resident wants, and it still happens, is just eye-opening. And I really thank you guys for this, because I had no clue. Not saying that I didn't know that this doesn't happen all over the country, but just seeing it firsthand and hearing the things that we're going through right now, is things that happened in the past, is just sickening.
Thank you, Natalie. Layla?
I'm gonna throw some words out that I heard, and then I want to add one word to it. You know, like everyone is saying, this is eye-opening for me, but to put some words to it: red light, housing development, author of color law, segregation by design, all of these different words, block busting, you know, all of these different words is something I would research, because you got my attention, you know. But one thing that keep coming back to me as I'm hearing this is gentrification. It fits in here some way, because, you know, if you put us over here for a reason, and then years later, you demolish the same area that you designed us to be in, and then you come full circle and take us out, you know, that's where the gentrification come in. And I believe that fits into that too. That's another word we can put in that, because I see it in all the different cities and states that I go to, you know. So it's definitely design, you know. This is where you want us, you know, many years ago. Now you don't want us there. So now you figure out a way to get us out, gentrification. Then you bring something else back in, and now you displace the ones that you place. So yeah, I don't see it in my lifetime either, but I'm definitely going to advocate. I'm like ready, y'all. I'm ready to do something to make a difference some type of way. So thank you for this. I've already called my coalition leader and asked, how can we bring this in? I need this training to come to Colorado Springs. So thank you.
Thank you. Mike, I want to just thank you for paying Layla to say that part, and for setting us up for the next part of the video. Okay, I wasn't supposed to say that part. Okay, my fault. Let's go to the next part of the video, because I think it's going to illustrate a bunch of the things that folks have brought up. Go ahead.
While many de jure segregation policies aim to keep African Americans far from white residential areas, public officials also shifted African American populations away from downtown business districts so that white commuters, shoppers, and business elites would not be exposed to Black people. This was accomplished with slum clearance. One slum clearance tool was the construction of a federal interstate highway system. In many cases, state and local governments, with federal acquiescence, designed interstate highway routes to destroy urban African American communities. In the 1950s, there was a white middle-class neighborhood in Los Angeles that wealthy African Americans began to move into. It was called Sugar Hill. The first thing that happened was that the neighborhood association got together and tried to buy out the African American families who were moving in, offering them more money than the African Americans had paid in order to get them out of the neighborhood. When that didn't work, white homeowners tried to enforce a legal agreement prohibiting them from living in the neighborhood. And when that didn't work, the city council then decided it would be an African American neighborhood. It rezoned it for multiple family housing. It eventually became a slum. And then the Santa Monica Freeway was built to clear that slum to destroy the neighborhood. So these policies all work together in an unconstitutional fashion to segregate Los Angeles.
Any quick reactions to that one? Folks have seen that in their spaces.
Mo, again, just to add very quickly, in addition to what you just showed us, I think too, once the Black people move in their zone, what do? They exit themselves. So they leave, yes. That happens a lot in Boston, or has happened. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And also that we've got to remember that it's, we can't put the blame on the people. Like, if you come and offer me 3 times what my house is worth, there's a good chance I'm going to sell it to you. Or 3 times what I paid for it, maybe not 3 times what it's worth, or 6 times what I paid for it, which is what we see a lot in communities. And sometimes we use the word dislocation instead of just gentrification, because it's not necessarily just people coming, a kind of different social class coming into it. It's really about dislocating the people that are there for another purpose. So appreciate that. Thank you for bringing that in, Gibson Green. Go ahead, Katie.
Just going off of your point, it basically is a form of financial manipulation, as to not put the blame on the people. It's a way to, literally financially manipulate people into selling their homes to play into this systemically racist policies that have been put in place. So the people should not be blamed in any way.
There is a place for folks to, organize and get together and do something about it. I think we've got to make sure that we keep the target on the system and not on the people there. So absolutely. Let's go to the next one.
In 1957, Bill and Daisy Myers were able to purchase a home in Levittown, Pennsylvania, the Levitt Company's second large development. When the mail carrier discovered that he was delivering mail to an African-American family, he let everyone in the neighborhood know, and as many as 600 white demonstrators soon showed up in front of the Myers' house, pelting the family and their home with rocks. Law enforcement stood by as this happened. For 2 months, rocks were thrown, crosses were burned, the Ku Klux Klan symbol was painted on the wall next door. Some policemen stood with the mob, joking and encouraging its participants. One sergeant was actually demoted to patrolman because he objected to orders he had been given not to interfere with the rioters. In 1951, World War II veteran Harvey Clark, his wife Janetta, and 2 small children rented an apartment in all-white Cicero, a suburb of Chicago. When the Clarks refused to leave, a mob of 4,000 rioted, raiding the apartment, destroying the fixtures, and throwing the family's belongings out the window onto the lawn where they were set ablaze. Time magazine reported that the police officers present, quote, acted like ushers politely handling the overflow at a football stadium, unquote. The only people that the grand jury indicted were Harvey Clark, his real estate agent, his NAACP attorney, and the white landlady who rented the apartment to him, as well as her attorney, on charges of inciting a riot and conspiring to lower property values. Stories like this were commonplace, and state-sponsored violence was a means, along with many others, by which all levels of government maintained segregation.
Well, that one was pretty clear about the engagement of our public safety space. Any reactions to that? Go ahead, Bethany.
I think the thing that really stands out to me is the fact that there's kind of 2 sides to this coin, right? We look at these policies that have harmed and held back and oppressed people of color in the country. That's real. The other side of that is that these policies have helped white people. And I think that that is a lot of the resistance that you see from white people in even acknowledging that these things exist, because nobody wants to be a racist. Nobody thinks that they're racist. But if you're white in this country, you have benefited from a racist system. And that's just the reality.
Other thoughts?
I just want to say thank you for an honest answer just now about the beneficial that the white folks have had in white America. We do not hear that true statement that was made from a white person. Mm-hmm. So thank you for being honest and transparency on that statement. And Mo, just for it to start that out from from policing property,
Mm-hmm.
and it just grew. So I thank you for your answer.
Other reactions, Ezekiel?
I think another thing that struck me in this section especially was the sergeant getting demoted to patrolman for trying to stop the racial violence, the racist white supremacist violence, and just that as a direct counter to this idea that that's when the system isn't working, when the system is working in the way that it's designed to, it's forwarding white supremacy at all times, regardless of who the individual police officers are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Chris?
I was just thinking of the difference between policy and enforcement. Originally we were seeing a lot of policy issues that were coming up, laws and legislation that actively harm. And then there was private groups that, the housing markets that kind of have their schemes and things. But here it was just as far as all laws are considered violence isn't okay, burning people's stuff isn't okay, but enforcement doesn't happen equally. So regardless of what the policy is, or whose job it is to enforce it, that gets actively ignored if it's for Black people or other groups in this country.
Thank you, Chris. Any other reactions or thoughts on that? Is that a hand, Katie? Go ahead.
I just, what really stood out to me was the term rioting, and how there's instances of all these white people rioting and destroying the property of Black families and causing them to be unsafe and, really destroying their sense of safety. And then to counter that with the reports of rioting with the Black Lives Matter protests, especially after the murder of George Floyd, and how it was, criminalized, the rioting by primarily Black people was criminalized. But then we look back in history and this rioting by white people was, looked at as totally okay. The police officers were basically participating in it. And it just then is another instance that goes to show you that these laws were not created to protect Black and brown bodies. They were meant to protect white people only.
Sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Amira. No, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. Thank you so much for actually saying that. I really want to raise what you said. I really agree. I think there's also a racialization of the word riot as well when it does come to, when we think of who's rioting and who's standing up for an issue that they're passionate about, making it more racialized when it's about the Black community compared to when it's compared to whites. And something else I wanted to lift up that I just realized, that the people that were actually tried and found guilty in the case for Harvey Clark was Harvey Clark himself, his real estate agent, and the NAACP attorney that that represented him. And I forgot what they were found guilty for, but I think it was for integrating the neighborhood. So the fact that his property, and again, it just shows too who is deserving of protection and protection by the police and public safety, and even by law, who is protected. You can't, this Black family was, their property was destroyed and they were not protected. They tried to bring it to court and they were found guilty. So I just wanted to lift that up because it just hit me, and I think that's crazy.
Just for clarity, they were indicted. They weren't found guilty. They were indicted. They and the white lady who rented the apartment and her attorney, they were all indicted for those things. And then over time through the courts, they were adjudicated, and a lot of the cases were dropped. But by bringing the case forward, they were indicted for the thing that happened to them. And thank you, Mayor, for bringing up the racialization of riot. Race riot was a term used primarily before the 1960s for white groups coming together and sometimes killing people, but destroying property, trying to enforce racism and segregation. that was what a race riot was until you got to the 60s, where you had some aspects of rebellion in Watts and other places, that then those things got called race riots. And so our formalization of riot being racialized is very new. The previous 150 years, race riots were almost exclusively white groups taking action against a Black person or Black people. So,
and when we talk
Kara?
about the,
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just saying, we talked about the war on, like we talked about the war on drugs, right? And like that was, that was a response to sort of like drug use, but it was also, right, like a way, in response to the civil rights protests of the 1960s, and in response to these quote unquote race riots, right? That was also a way to sort of respond to that. So it kind of, I'm glad we're kind of connecting the dots between some of these things, like some of these sort of like urbanization and suburbanization policies, the sort of creation of certain communities, segregated communities, and the sort of public safety elements. I want us to keep making those connections, but Kara, go ahead.
Thanks, Mike. Well, I just want to like own that, like my participation in all of this, accidentally feels really important to like own and apologize and repair, of like working for community coalitions doing substance use prevention. And we don't stop and make sure everybody's at the table. And so if we don't do that, we have white people at the table making decisions about people of color and white people's lives. And then we don't know what the real story is. And then we put all of our money and energy into really stopping white cis boys from smoking pot. I mean, let's be honest. I don't really give a shit if white cis boys smoke pot, because they're not really coming addicted for the rest of their lives. It's really small rates. It's when we have kids in our school, in Northampton schools, going to the school committee, telling their experience racism, and we know life expectancies are really lowered for the weathering that white people do to people of color. Like, I just want to be like, DPH, stop funding us to do substance use prevention and start funding us to do equity work, so we can have this conversation. That's like, I know it's moving in that direction, and I'm really glad that it's moving in that direction, but I just want, we need to, like, this is the conversation we should all be having. Everybody should be having in all of our coalitions, and not spending one more second on looking at data that is with white people, all white people at the table. At least I'll speak for my community. So it feels like, how can I do the work right now in the work that I'm doing and connect the dots? That I'm part of it too. It's not like some other white people out there somewhere doing this. Like, I need to do it now. And if I'm not doing now, I'm complicit in it.
Thank you. Shay, and then we're going to go back to the video. Go ahead, Shay.
Okay. Oh my goodness, Mo and Tim, I'm loving this even more. Listening to everybody's feedback. I was at a meeting yesterday regarding housing. And it's, as you mentioned today, it's all part of this. And the question was that people are not finding housing. It's getting too expensive. And the person who was sharing with us mentioned, you need to, and I wanted more question regarding equity, regarding those barriers, the systemic barriers. How do we get on those boards? Because on those boards are all people who never have to want housing, that are making upper, money. So, and people are not on the boards, minorities like us, that should have a voice and that should be talking in order to change that system. Again, as Kara mentioned, let's keep doing it. And let's try to find people to get on those boards. So to change the narrative. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to say, let's watch the next 5 minutes all together, and then we'll do a debrief afterwards. So you have a couple sections that happen there, but we're going to string them together this time. All right, folks, okay with that? Yeah, okay. All right, Katie says it's okay, we can do it. Go ahead.
Today, African American incomes are about 60% of white incomes. But African American wealth is about 10% of white wealth. Most middle-class families in this country gain their wealth from the equity they have in their homes. So this enormous difference between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is almost entirely attributable to federal housing policy implemented through the 20th century. African American families that were prohibited from buying homes in the suburbs in the 1940s and 50s, and even into the 60s by the Federal Housing Administration, gained none of the equity appreciation that whites gained. Across the country in new developments, these homes in the late 1940s and 1950s sold for about twice national median income. They were affordable to working class families with an FHA or VA mortgage. African Americans were equally able to afford those homes as whites, but were prohibited from buying them. Today, those homes sell for $300,000 to $400,000 at the minimum, 6 to 8 times national median income. The white families sent their children to college with the wealth they gained from appreciating home equity. They were able to take care of their parents in old age and not depend on their children. They were able to bequeath wealth to their children. None of those advantages accrued to African Americans, who for the most part were prohibited from buying homes in those suburbs. So in 1968, we passed the Fair Housing Act that said, in effect, okay, African Americans, you're now free to buy homes in the suburbs that had been forbidden. But it's an empty promise, because those homes are no longer affordable to the families whose parents or grandparents could have afforded them when whites were buying into those suburbs and gaining the equity and wealth that followed from their purchases. Consider children who come from families where they're economically stressed, or in poor health because they have no access to good health care, or because they live in polluted environments. When they do come to school, for example, they may suffer from asthma because of that pollution and are drowsy from being awake at night, wheezing. They cannot then typically achieve at levels of children who come to school well rested. When you concentrate children like that in single classrooms, it's impossible for teachers to develop the kind of outcomes that they can in middle-class children who come to school healthy, unstressed, and able to pay attention to schooling. What economists know is that African American children from low-income families who grow up in segregated neighborhoods are less likely as adults to move into the middle class than are African American children whose families have the same low incomes but who live in integrated neighborhoods. So segregation itself impedes intergenerational mobility and perpetuates, rigidifies the inequality that we experience. Another thing that social psychologists have discovered is that decision-making is hampered when you don't have diverse decision-making groups. These psychologists have done experiments where they put people together to solve problems in both diverse groups and in segregated groups. And the diverse groups are much better able to solve problems because they challenge assumptions much more than the segregated groups do. So segregation impedes our political and economic success. We have 3 provisions in the federal Constitution that prohibit the kinds of actions that federal, state, and local governments pursued to create residential segregation. One is the 5th Amendment, which requires the federal government to treat all citizens fairly. Another is the 14th Amendment that requires state and local governments not only to treat citizens fairly, but to treat them equally. And then the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, also requires that we banish the effects of slavery, which Congress long ago determined was any form of second-class citizenship. So in fact, the prohibition on African Americans to purchase homes in federally subsidized white communities or the segregation of public housing created a form of second-class citizenship, which was a violation of the 13th Amendment. We cannot reverse de jure segregation mainly with lawsuits. We must also build a national political consensus leading to legislation, a challenging but not impossible task. Our focus now should be to develop policies that promote an integrated society, understanding it will be impossible to fully untangle the web of unconstitutional inequality that we've woven. To begin, we should first contemplate what we have collectively done and, on behalf of our government, accept responsibility to fix it.
Right. Thank you all for joining us in that journey in that powerful video. I'm going to recommend to you, as I recommend to everyone, the Color of Law book. This video captures maybe 10%, 15% of what's in that book. I mean, it's really like deep dive into these issues. And please watch it for yourself. Share it with the people who you love and share it with the people who maybe you don't have as good a relationship with. Thank you, Maria, for putting it up there. I was reaching for it myself, but I didn't find it. Any reactions to that last bit? Anything come up for you or stand out for you in that last few minutes? I'm looking at some faces, folks who I haven't heard so much from. Eli, what are you thinking?
Thanks for calling on me. I was sort of thinking about, like, it was clearly the policies, those federal housing policies were very intentional. So I feel like to reconcile that intentionality of the past, like now you need to be even more intentional than ever to really recognize the just inequities that resulted from the clearly racist housing policies that existed in the past and still have clearly racial outcomes today. So I think that word just intentionality, like that intentional action, I think that's what coming for me.
All right, Maria.
Yeah, so for me, I think about like the generational wealth impact, and not just impact in terms of like home ownership, but the impact of having the ability to send your kids to college, the ability for your kids to inherit your home and then be able to take their income and not contribute 30% of it towards their home, but be able to invest in it. So the long-term wealth that is impacted by all of that, just by not allowing people to buy homes based on race is ridiculous. And you see the generational impact of that as you go forward.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's a lot of little tidbits there to also pull at. You know, we create a system then perpetuates the things that we keep seeing. Our ideas of how and where crime happens are set up by where these systems created spaces for disinvestment and lack of opportunity and hopelessness. These are fomented by the systems into spaces. Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, this is rewatching the video is also making me think back to Tuesday when we talked about definitions of public safety and kind of that were kind of incomplete, right? And so, and two things are coming up for me. One is that sense of like safety is about protection from something or someone, right? And so like you really see that like exemplified in the way that these communities are built, like the literal wall around the community, right? Or when you think about, you know, Mo and I, in prepping for this training, we're talking about Trayvon Martin, we're talking about Ahmaud Arbery, and talking about the sense of like who belongs in a certain public space or a certain residential space and who doesn't, and how police or like police adjacent actors are used to protect those spaces, right? And so I think when you accept a protective definition of public safety, like that's kind of, that can be kind of what we get, unfortunately. And there was a second thing I was thinking about from definitions that I'm now completely blanking on. So I'll yield the floor to whoever wants to speak next.
If it comes back, bring it back. Other folks, any other reactions or thoughts from this?
I was just thinking about just picking back off what Mike just said, the number of young people recently that have been shot by police in the state and like in Massachusetts, sorry. And there's like no mainstream coverage of it, like anywhere. Like you literally have to dig to get any information. And again, how systemic that is, like you literally have to be very intentional about not sharing that, and how the mental health for at least two that I know of, the families called the police for support to help those young people that were suffering. And again, going back to like how do these families, our families, feel safe calling the police? So we're stigmatized when we don't call the police, and then when we do call the police, our children are murdered. It's just, I don't know, there's so much going on in my head right now. I'm still processing. Sorry, Mike.
All good, Michelle. This should be really confounding, and we should really be pushed by it. And thank you, folks who put that in the chat. Part of our conversation is, if we want to reimagine public safety, we've got to look at the roots of the current system and think about how we address those roots, and also how do we address the operants of it now. Our police force are a social contract and an actual contract that we make with the police. So they have a contract that their union and the unions involved sign with your municipality that dictates how they are compensated, what they do, what they're about, what their accountability is. That's the actual contract. And then there's a social contract that we say, we want this set of people to help make us safe and protect us from X, Y, and Z. We want to interrogate some of that going forward, but we are going to take a break right now because we've had a lot of your attention for a very long time. So Gina's going to make me give you 10 minutes. You know, I'm not that generous, but thankfully she's here to keep me in line. So let's have you back at 11:25, and we will continue with our conversation.
Okay, it's like, why is my unmute button not unmuting? All right, so Gina, if you could pull up the slides, that'd be awesome. But so to sort of give us what we're going to do in the last hour or so that we have together, we want to think, you know, we've talked kind of expansively about like public safety, both, you know, thinking about things like law enforcement, but even broader than that, we've talked about housing, we've talked about, you know, I think folks mentioned food security, we talked about healthcare on day one when we were brainstorming, right? And so a little bit later, we're gonna put you in a breakout room. We're gonna ask you to do some sort of creative design around a sort of public safety structure for your own community, right? What kind of things would you want us to make sure we're taken care of, by whom, right, in order to sort of ensure the public safety of your own community. But first, we want to think about all of the different things that like might impact our safety, right, as we've talked about. So if we go to the next slide, I have a question for you. So what are some other things that impact safety? So besides housing and policing that we've talked about, what are those things that you would say impact safety? We want to get them all on sort of a screen, and then we're going to I'm going to kind of summarize, pull out some themes so you can think about, okay, make sure we kind of cover these things or address these things when we do our sort of creative design work in breakouts later. All right, so if we go to the next slide, Gina. So the question is, what are some other things that impact safety? It's kind of reworded here. What are some additional elements of public safety? But folks, feel free to just unmute, share in the chat. And I think Gina's going to help capture, or Tanaya's going to help capture some of these things so we have them. But what would you put on that list? We need this to ensure our public safety.
I would say trained mental health advocates to go and respond to community members in distress.
Awesome, thanks, Katie. So trained mental health advocates. I'm seeing a bunch of things in the chat. I see food security from Rebecca. I see healthcare and transportation access from Ezekiel. I see education from Natalie. I see honesty from Kara. I see community from Ezekiel. I see transportation, tech and internet equity and reliable access. Yes, give me that municipal broadband right away. Love that, Emily. Layla,
sorry.
Layla, and then Amira, and then I'll go to you, Heather. How about that?
Thanks. Having stakeholders meetings so we can get a buy-in. And that's what we're doing in one of our projects. We're having stakeholders meeting in different areas of the community to get buy-in. So actually it's the safety stakeholder meetings that we're having.
Great. Folks actually talking to each other who are going to be impacted by this kind of policy. Amira?
Yes, I definitely agree, Layla. And to add on to that, neighborhood walkability. So I know that, I don't know, like you might have mentioned this earlier, but even being able to walk around your neighborhood, and that can be like the built environment. So actually having sidewalks to walk on, and things that actually control traffic patterns, especially as we think of youth and being able to walk to school and walk to community centers. It's very important for safety.
Great. Heather and then Shay.
So that piggybacks right into what I was concerned about, and it's access for people who can't walk, or like have mobility issues. For example, being able to open a door either into a building or into the bathroom, if it's not electrified, is impossible for me a lot of days. And I'm not in a chair yet, but I will be. So if I can't get into a building, I don't really feel safe even going out of my house. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. So like accessibility, right? I mean, I can't tell you how many Somerville city government meetings I've been on in the last few months where, you know, people had to take to Twitter afterwards and be like, why aren't these slides available ahead of time? Like, why aren't we, you know, meeting in an accessible space, right? Why aren't, you know, these businesses are not adhering to the ADA requirements, like all these things, right? That affect people's ability to access space, right? And maintain their own safety. So thank you for adding that, Heather. Shay?
Yes, thank you. As someone who serve a population that has a disability, having people that are serving those communities being trained, not only those that are on one-on-one giving the care, but also those in the position of leadership, which is really extremely important, you know, so we can keep abuse out of that system. And very, very, very important, tremendously. And also what I mentioned earlier, for minorities, Black and Browns, BIPOC, and all of that, have a voice. Run for your school board. Do this, do that, because the more representation that you have, you can really change that narrative that is happening. So stand up and be part of the leadership. Have a voice and demand a voice to be at that table. It's so important. Thank you.
Thank you. Natalie?
So just to clarify what I said about education, and I think Nichelle hit on it a little bit too, like trainings, also stopping the school to pipeline things that happen in the school, in the education system. That is real. I have ran into that with my own children, raising Black and Black men in the community where I live. School to pipeline is a real thing. And I really think that when it gets broken down to teachers, they will see how folks that are not necessarily, you know, with disabilities and learning disabilities, how they are not accepted and they get passed along instead of educated. So that's what I meant by education.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Tons of things in the chat, and I know Gina or Tanaya or somebody is racing to capture all these things. Anything else that folks wanna add?
I would also add that the public safety measures that are taken in the community should be created by the community members themselves. So actual participation from the community, because, you know, they know best, the community knows best what they need for their own safety needs. And like an outsider shouldn't be coming in and dictating that.
Beautiful. So I'm going to attempt to summarize not everything obviously we've said here, but kind of like broad categories that we think are important to consider when we're sort of designing public safety, right? So I'm seeing a lot about like the built environment, right? Like our sidewalks and streets, whether they're accessible or not, whether there's transit or things that ways that I can get around, like all of those things, I would kind of categorize under like the built environment. I'm seeing, you know, things around people getting their needs met or having access to getting their needs met. So things like healthcare, seeing things like education, right? And people sort of getting the learning that they need free of sort of the school to prison pipeline, I've heard as well. I'm seeing training and education, sort of whether that be for law enforcement, whether it be for community members, for individuals around their own sort of biases or racism or whatever may be coming up. I'm seeing something about emergency response, and I think this is important, right? We heard about sort of, you know, thinking about mental health care and thinking about mental health response, but how do we sort of handle emergency response? And a lot of times we get into these conversations around policing and law enforcement, right? There's a lot of disagreement about who holds what responsibility. You know, a lot of folks are starting to think that maybe the police hold too much responsibility to responding to every sort of emergency situation. So how is that held? Who is sort of responsible for that? And then I think also this idea around community stakeholdership, right? And community members having ownership or being involved or talking to one another across sort of different areas, different sectors that they may be focusing on. All sound like important things to me that are sort of coming out of this. Mo, any themes that I missed that you think are coming up here?
You know, we have such a progressive group in terms of looking at proactively creating safety. I think the part that we might be missing is a little bit more around the aspects that the current apparatus does and their orientation around law enforcement and crime investigation. So those are the other kind of functions of public safety that we should also be reimagining and redefining. So those would be the two I would add.
All right, brilliant list. So I don't want to overwhelm us, right, when we're in our small group. So I've kind of like pulled out those themes, copied them. I'm going to put them in the chat, right? So if we could actually go, and thank you, Gina/Tanayo, or Tanayo, I see. I was like, I can see who wrote that in the chat. But thank you, Tanayo, for capturing all those. And yes, we will be sharing those with you as well, so we won't forget them. But I'm going to share the themes right now so you don't have too much to think about for this next part in your small groups. But like I said, we're going to be thinking about, let's do some design work. Let's imagine, right, in my ideal community or in the ideal future of my community, like, what do these things look like? Who holds the responsibilities that are here? So let's look at the questions on the next slide. So if you were to build out a structure or structures to ensure safety in your community, what elements would the structure be responsible for? Okay, so again, the considerations, the themes that we talked about, I put in the chat that came up from that brainstorm. But really want you to think deeply about, you know, and get in your group, discuss, you know, disagree if you will, but we've got some questions that kind of help you sort of build that out, so that we want you to answer. So on the next slide, here are the questions. So what individuals or agencies will be responsible for what elements of public safety? So all those themes that I just put in the chat, like who's doing that? Each of those things. Is it law enforcement? Is it community? Is it the healthcare system? Is it the education system, the schools? Like, is the government doing stuff versus are the people doing stuff, right? Like we talked about that kind of distinction. So talk about that kind of thing. What role should be in the hands of community versus law enforcement? And that might mean, like, are there things that law enforcement is doing now that we don't want them to be doing and that, you know, some other actors or individuals should take on? Are there other actors that are integral to creating public safety? What kind of relationships would need to exist, right? And somebody mentioned like community stakeholder meetings and things like that that are about public safety, bringing in more people. And lastly, in what ways is your design radically different from what exists in your community today? I think that's really important, right? Because like if we're thinking about reimagining, right? I think we have to be serious about saying things actually need to change. We actually need to let go of some things, right? and it's going to look different. And we might feel unsafe by letting go of certain things because of our sense of security might be threatened. But does that actually mean our safety is gone if something changes around that, right? Now, there's a lot of questions, a lot to consider. You don't necessarily have to go through one by one and answer all of these questions, but hopefully this can kind of guide your discussion. And as a group, maybe reach a consensus around, okay, we definitely want, this structure to hold this thing, or we definitely want these individuals to be involved in the public safety for this. Does this kind of make sense, what we're going to do? Anything I can clarify about that? Mo, anything to add?
No, just excited about the conversation. Looks like Emily has a hand up.
Yeah, I was gonna say Emily.
Hi, yes. Do you want us to capture this in notes or something? Because I feel like
that would be
everyone's
awesome.
ideas, it's going to be amazing, and where everyone is coming from and representing. Okay, so I'll try and take notes in my small group.
If folks could just designate like a note taker, it could be like some bullet points on a piece of paper or in a Google Doc or a Word doc or whatever, but just kind of jot down like, where do you land? What kind of things would you want to make sure were included in this little plan? And then hopefully we can share back. So we'll try to give you a good amount of time. So I'd say around 20 minutes, maybe Mo. So we'll come back around noon, and maybe we'll hear back what folks talked about before we kind of close out. Thanks for that question, Emily. Really helpful. All right, I'm really looking forward to see what people imagine and vision. And it doesn't have to be perfect. And I think combined, right, we'll have a lot of ideas that we can think about bringing back to our own community, bringing back to our own advocacy, wherever that may lay, after we conclude. So I'll let Tanayo break you all off into groups of 3 or 4, and hopefully have a really great discussion. All right, so welcome back. Hopefully that was a good, lengthy, deep, enriching discussion in your small groups. So the first thing, we're gonna have some folks report back. We're probably not gonna get to every group. So we would really appreciate it if you did jot down notes, to share them with us in some way, to put them in the chat or take a picture and we can email it to us as part of the follow-up. But we'd love to sort of compile the great ideas that people came up with so we don't lose those. And we'll also, of course, have, what people share out will be captured by the recording as well. But it looks like Bethany wants to jump in. So go ahead, Bethany.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, I'm going to have to hop off in a couple of minutes, and I was our note taker. So if I could go ahead and go, I'd appreciate it. Fantastic discussion. Thank you guys so much. So many great ideas. The first thing that we talked about was having a committee within the community that's made up of decision makers, of community leaders, other voices in the community, and forming a committee to review existing policies that influence safety of the public as a whole, and especially looking at policies that are racially inequitable, and really getting down to the foundational level of where the lack of safety has arisen from for some groups. So having policy reform, and that would be around voting, around how housing, around how public safety officers are trained. We also talked about alternatives to the prison system for nonviolent criminals, or to how restructuring the kind of punitive system that exists right now, and looking more as well at the training of the police force, moving them away from violence as a form of control, and adding more mental health services, having a broader range of responses than just violence or incarceration, and just really re-examining the fact that the police force we have now is a lot like the slave patrols that we were talking about at the last session, and how can that evolve to actually meet people's needs for safety. We also talked about access to quality education, for across the board, more equitable educational funding sources, and how that can lift up the community and make communities more safe. I think that's pretty much everything I have written down. So guys, please jump in if I missed anything or if you wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you, Bethany. Any folks from that group want to add anything? Yes, round of applause. Round of applause. Great plan.
That was great. Thank you.
You said a lot of really interesting things. I'm thinking about when you said alternatives, right? And I know this is something that a lot of municipalities in Massachusetts are considering right now. Mo and I are having a conversation about the city of Cambridge, the city of Lynn. Like a lot of these cities have sort of set aside money to sort of build out emergency response infrastructure, you know, for example, around mental health, right, that exists outside of police departments, right? And kind of, somebody mentioned earlier, sort of like trained professionals that aren't, you know, carceral or punitive, having the ability and the funding and the resources and training to actually respond to those things. So that, you know, I think that's something that came out of the uprisings of 2020, right? And the demand for change in the regard of public safety and policing. So I think that might be something to look out for if you're interested in that. Great. So thank you to that group. Another group that wants to volunteer to share a little bit?
I did not take notes, but I can share a little bit about what Rosina and I talked about. One thing that we got into a little bit was the importance of having basic needs met and like addressing root causes. Mm-hmm. And how mental health is often a root cause, but that deeper than that, housing and food security and healthcare access and sort of all of the other things that can be stressors are often the root causes of mental health challenges. So, you know, if we're really sort of committed to changing what public safety looks like, we would need to be providing all of those basic needs without all of the hoops that people currently have to jump through, and without making it so challenging for people to get into housing or to get access to healthy food or to have access to healthcare. Like, it takes so much time and effort right now. And again, we talked a little bit about how that still comes back to funding, and it's easier said than done, but
yeah, in public, you know, we're a public health institute, and we talk a lot about upstream and downstream interventions and things like that, right? And so I think we can think about crime, violence, or harm as sort of the downstream, right? And so many of our interventions are, well, let's just like prevent crime, let's just enforce crime, right? When the underlying root causes, like you just said, Rebecca, are like way before that, way prior to that. And we almost never really think about, like, you know, I've learned so much from Mo and some of our friends who work on their gun violence prevention project. I think Michelle was here earlier. That does exactly that and thinks about, well, what are the root causes of the gun violence that we're seeing, right? And how do we actually address those things, and not just say, well, let's just, like, you know, add more police or add more law enforcement, when that doesn't really actually solve the issue or prevent the issue from happening. Awesome. Anybody want to add anything from that group? Thanks, Rebecca. Okay. Love to hear from another group. Emily?
Well, I just want to say that I linked kind of the Google Doc that I was taking notes from our separate discussion group. So feel free to add just to help Tonayo, I'm sorry. You're so close to Tamayo. That's my last name. Anyway, I got excited. But if you just want to add, I just want to invite everybody to just kind of put your own notes in there so that we can capture and make Tonayo's life a little easier, which I put in the chat. Should I take
any highlights you want to?
Yeah, I'll just, okay. Group, I'm sorry, I'll just talk about what we talked about. Okay, so two of the other people in our group, they mainly do like health department and work with like within like city government structures. So a lot of our focus, I work on a grant, which is about increasing outdoor access and removing barriers to outdoor experiences with my grant. And I also work at a nonprofit that focuses on outdoor education, but I'm located here in Colorado Springs. So a lot of the focus was really on stopping the pipeline from school to prison, something that was kind of talked about. And this is, huge because, it always comes back to funding, right? Policing and prison systems are hugely lucrative, which is what we're going against. But we were thinking possibly restorative justice initiatives funded by nonprofits, city government, and state departments to really utilize that as a model to prevent and to utilize a different justice model that's not immediately go straight into, to prison. So we want to disrupt that pipeline. That was something that kind of has shown to be good, but it's just severely underfunded, so we could fund that more. Really looking at the system of mental illness within our cities, maybe having better outpatient systems. I'm a huge proponent of universal health care because I think that would reduce so much pain and suffering, at least from what I experienced. Decriminalizing marijuana, especially retroactively for people that are in prison now, which unfortunately, many people of color are still in prison just for marijuana use and dealing. So retroactively, we're, taking care of those sentences. Working with tribal governments and Native nations to recover land and create relationships to highlight and support Native people. As an outdoor person, who works in the outdoor industry, I feel like this is super fundamental for safety, especially for Native people who live with us and who are still on their land. But how do we create more formalized relationships, especially like within the communities, to provide support and also to, have Native peoples recover land? That would be my radically different design. Is like, I want Native nations to recover land. And then, how do we create, and this is something that we were still kind of talking about, is that housing piece, the right to housing first. Nichelle mentioned this like housing first model, which I think is absolutely needed because housing is really the center of like so much insecurity and safety. But I don't think we talked about who would be responsible for this or how we can create that work there. But really just trying to navigate the systems of bureaucracy. So how do we lessen that navigational complexity?
That's awesome. There's so many really awesome ideas. We talked, for a really long time today about housing segregation. Like we didn't even talk about like the land, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like we barely touched on that, right? And like literally all these things we're talking about are fundamentally built on people being dispossessed, right? People's safety being compromised for centuries and still today. So like, I really appreciate you bringing that up. And I also like you brought up housing first. Like I said, I work on an opioid project, and we recently had a big conversation about housing and how that impacts people's capacity to deal with substance use, with addiction, to seek recovery, right? And like all these things are like so interconnected. I think that's really become clear from our conversation. So like, it's big, right? There's a lot, but I appreciate folks thinking a little bit about like, well, where can we start? How can we sort of start having this conversation in our community? How can we build some of these things up? Natalie, I see your hand.
So we touched on a lot of things that you guys have already mentioned in the chat and updates. The first answer to the question, the first question answer in my group, I was in group 4. We said coalitions and community agencies should be the individuals or agencies responsible for safety, public safety, such as nonprofits. We all basically worked in nonprofit organizations that help in these areas, such as housing, food insecurities, transportation, and so forth. And what roles should be in the hands of the community. And others, I'm sorry, this is blocking. Hold on one second. What roles should be in the hands of the community versus law enforcement? So it came up that peers and community members should have those roles and stop the police from getting big money and big overtime for safety events. And community members should be trained and put in those roles. And also we discussed shifts in funding for the radically different, in what ways is your design radically different from what exists in your community? So we said shifts in funding. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalie. And I love that idea of like peer community sort of trained individuals to occupy some of these roles, right? I think about like, you know, do we need like to pay police a bunch of overtime to like sit at like some construction site on the side of the highway, right? like things like that. I think about the way folks already do this, right? With like, oh, we have marshals at a parade, or like if there's a protest, there's folks who are like responsible for first aid and things like that. So these are things we can do, right? If we have the will to do them. I thought I saw a hand. Was it Katie? Go ahead.
One thing Amira and I talked about in our group was the implementation of the community school model. And I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with that, but it basically is instead of the school just being a place of education for the students going there, it becomes more of like a family resource center where families can have access to certain resources, and the students themselves. Like for example, I was watching this YouTube video one time where one community school, there was a high rate of teenage pregnancies at the school. So they implemented like a child care center in the school. So those individuals could still get their education while their child was being cared for. Another example would be to have like washing machines in the school so the students could have clean clothes. Just examples like that to kind of make the school more of a prominent resource in the community for both students and families.
I love that. I love that. Thank you so much. You know, so many wonderful like ideas, right? And, you know, I mentioned how these things are all kind of big and interconnected, and it can seem daunting, right? But I really do believe that like we can work together to take action and really move things and shake things up. I'm thinking about, as we're talking, I live in Somerville, Massachusetts, as I may have mentioned at some point in the last couple of days. And, you know, there's this big push right now by the city to put $50 million into a new quote unquote public safety building. And functionally, it's going to be essentially a police headquarters and a fire headquarters. And there's been a really kind of unexpected coalition that has kind of cropped up of community members who live in the public housing development that the site is going to be placed nearby. The folks who are interested in like making better traffic and safer streets, right? The folks who are interested in protecting trees, the folks who are interested in defunding the police or reforming the police, like have all kind of like coalesced around this, like to oppose this like plan by the city, saying like, this isn't actually what we need to like have a better, safer, healthier community. Like, let's think about other ways we could spend this money. And I just think it's like, it's really interesting and kind of beautiful, like microcosm of like the ways that communities can come together, even folks who have different perspectives and are working on different things. So I definitely like encourage folks to like, pay attention to those things in your own neighborhood, in your own city. Look at what the city is doing, look at what the money is being spent on, right? Are those things actually going to promote our public health and our public safety? If not, how do we sort of move against that or move in different ways together? So really love this wonderful conversation. I'm so sad we have to cut it off because I know we could keep going for so long. But we do have sort of one additional activity that we want to do before we close and share our feedback form and resources and all of that. So Mo, I'm going to ask you to tell us what to do, and then we'll keep going.
Great. So in capturing some of the essence of what folks have been talking about here, there were like a thinking about safety in kind of two directions seems to be something that we need to make sure that we do. So I'm going to ask you to do this kind of virtual postcard with me. Safety from and safety to. So as you're thinking about the safety that you would like to have, what do you want to be safe from, and what do you want to be safe to be able to do? I'll just ask folks if we could put it in the chat, safe from and safe to. And just put it in the chat and we'll do a little bit of debriefing around it. What do we want to be safe from, and what do we want to be safe to? And the safe to can be broad. It can be not just do, it can be safe to be, safe to, you know, lots of different things. Doesn't have to be only physical things. Just ask if folks want to put it in the chat, and then we'll take a few folks. Shay, if you want to just hang on for us a bit, let's give folks a minute.
Oh, thank you.
No worries. Try to make sure that you pair your safe from with your safe to as well. Love that, Amira. Kudos, Emily and Michelle. Thank you, Bill and Chris. Thank you, Ms. Gibson Green. All right. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Kara. Shay, go ahead.
Yes, I am so sorry. It's easier for me.
It's all good. It's all good. Just give us your
Okay.
safe from and to.
All right. It's echoing. Okay. So I think in 2 words, thank you. In 2 words, I say safe from the emotional abuse for my community, the Black and Black, Brown, and BIPOC and all of that. We've been through that too many times, you know. The jobs from the 19-something building up the road and not being seen as human beings, the Black people, Black and Brown, LGBTs, we want to be emotionally not experiencing those abuse, the microaggressions. Oh, la la. And also that's safe from, and also for us to be seen and be heard as decent human beings. So we can unpack that, but I don't have to. Equal rights for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Shay. Well said. Well said. Love the stuff that folks have been putting in the chat. Thank you, Natalie, and thank you, Maria. Thank you, Kara. I want to give it back to Mike so that we may do our closing. And I want to make sure that you have a chance to give us some feedback. But I want to thank you for that exercise and ask you to be as focused on the things that you want to do and be from safety as the things that we are trying to be safe from. That will give us the balance to create and reimagine safety. The imbalance is the reason that we have what we have so far. I'll send it back to Mike.
Yeah, thank you. So we wanted to give folks a chance to give us some feedback. So we can do that. We love to do that in the form of we call pluses and deltas. So from the last 2 days, I know it's been a few days since we had our first training, but thinking back to that as well. And tonight I was also putting a form in the chat where you can give us anonymous feedback. But if folks want to share anything right now, so a plus, that's something that you really liked about this training, you want to see replicated in future trainings. A delta being something you want to see changed for the future, for the next training, or for if we did this again with you, what would you like to see be different? So I'll just invite folks to put that in the chat for the next couple minutes. And then, of course, if you want to be anonymous and you want to really be honest, you can go to that. I think it's an anonymous form. Am I lying about that tonight? Okay, the form is anonymous, so no hard feelings either way. We really appreciate the feedback and definitely want to improve these trainings and talk about new topics and whatever people are interested in. So please drop in the chat a plus, a delta, a suggestion, anything like that. I do see a question about certificates of completion. I'm not equipped to answer that question. I don't know if there's somebody here who is. Tanaya or Gina.
Send me an email and I will do what I can for you.
Awesome. Thanks, Tanaya. Other feedback, pluses, deltas, likes, suggestions. Feel free to put in the chat. You can also unmute if that's easier.
Yeah, I'm just gonna unmute because I just don't feel like typing so much.
Please.
But I really do want to give you guys kudos. I think this was an amazing training. I never felt as comfortable to speak up in a training and share my knowledge and learn from other people, other like-minded people. And you guys definitely have so much expertise in just the racist histories and policies and the legacies today that are definitely impacting communities, not only in Massachusetts, but even the video was really great looking at other cities and states that just showing the whole legacy of racist policies. I really enjoyed both days of this training so much and been telling my coworkers about it. So yeah, I'm very thankful to be in this space and to learn from everyone else also speaking up in this space as well.
Thank you so much. And thank you for being here and adding your voice and your thoughts and your expertise. We appreciate it.
Yes, I want to also kudos on the training. Reimagining safety in our community would be a fearless and relentless and tireless fight in front of us and behind us. And so how do we give tools to the next generation to continue to fight a supremacist, to fight this segregation of racism? It's going to take a lot of us. So we know that community capacity building to enhance the quality of life for the next generation would be fearless, relentless, and a tireless fight. Thank you, though. These trainings are very important. It's good to see you again, Mo. Whenever you guys put out training, I'm always on top of it. And I try to pass it on, but great training. Thank you.
Thank you, brother. I appreciate it. Anything else from folks? And yeah, please capture what you think in the forum too. I know that helps, especially Gina and Tanayo, who are planning, who are behind the scenes doing so much work, making these things happen. Mo and I are just kind of riding the waves of all of their hard work. So we appreciate if you could share that, share what you all think with them in that survey. That'd be great. Anything else? Any last thoughts? once, twice. So I just want to say thank you all so much. You know, this training is only, we're getting a lot of love in the chat, but this training is only as good as like the people that show up. And this group of people was incredible. So y'all were so energized and committed and passionate and knowledgeable. And like I learned just as much as I'm sure everybody else did here. So I really appreciate you all being engaged in the conversation, talking to each other, teaching each other, and teaching us as well. So thank you for that. I'll give it to Mo if you want to say anything.
Yeah, I just want to thank you all so much for being in the conversation, for taking these conversations back to where you are doing your work and with the people who you interact with, the circles and tables that you are a part of. The work that we need to do is about not us holding little bits of knowledge, but really about sharing and broadening the conversation with as many people as possible. Ms. Gibson Green, I want you to hang on because I need to talk to you before we close out. So I'll catch you before, if you could just stay on for us till the end.
Gina?
With the rest of that, Gina, did you want to say anything? Folks
a quick
away.
reminder that we'll send out the slides and the feedback form, the recording of this training, so you all can share with your networks too, for anybody that wasn't able to make it for these last 2 days, and share that with you all. Thank you all so much. We'll see you at the next one. There's one coming up in a few weeks.
Michelle, we should talk about this for GVP.